In this example, what we're going to achieve is we're going to go through a bit more about how objects interact, kind of like as if the ground was cracking up and things like that. So it's a very simple exercise, but I think it's quite valuable to cover. So first of all, I'm just going to create a container. I'm going to drag this up a little bit in the air, not too high at all. Maybe bring it down a little bit too. The idea is that we've created a container for our bed of kind of sand or whatever we want it to be on the ground, kind of like a layer of mist. Next thing we need to create an emitter, so again, simple source. What we'll do here is make this a box rather than a sphere. I'll drag that out to roughly the same dimensions as the floor here. I'll lift that up above the floor just slightly. Depending on our voxel resolution, it is important that even if we are moving up slightly, it does need to be roughly at least one voxel above the other object, otherwise it will still consider it in its own space. So that's the first thing we need to do. Now let's go into our Fume Effects. First of all, make a tutorial 05 and save it there. Next thing is add in our emitter, as we always do. And we're just going to get rid of fire. Actually, not in here. We're going to tell it not to simulate fuel because we don't need fuel. So that way our fuel channel is taken out. We're just dealing with smoke. Give it a bit more detail. Okay, let's simulate this and see what happens. Right now, already it's created a layer of smoke from the first layer. So right away, I want to bring the opacity down considerably. I'm also going to set the color of this to be more of a dark, kind of brown, perhaps. So right away, this is always emitting, and it's got a bit of movement to it. What I'll do here is just get rid of all the vector information. So setting everything here to be next to no movement whatsoever. So the object and directional set to 0. Radial will leave a little bit so it can expand just a tiny bit. I've disabled the temperature and the fuel. We don't need that. All we need is the smoke. Okay, the next thing we'll do is let's go into simulation. Because I already had the scene here, we'll just would adjust the quality to 100. We'll set the detail, the fractal to 5, and I think one thing we'll do is add a bit of vorticity. This is kind of like turbulence, but not. It's more the vortices internally within it, just getting it to kind of curl just a little bit. We will give it a bit of velocity dampening and also a bit of turbulence as well. I'll set the scale a little lower. The idea is that now we're getting the smoke to kind of billow and move around a little bit. Not too much, but enough to get a little bit of motion. So here we're getting just a little bit of movement. Nothing too drastic. What I'll do now is go down to smoke. I'll set the dissipation to 0 and the minimum density to a little bit above. This is purely just to give it a little bit more of a basic motion, but we'll set the dissipation strength for the temperature as well to be quite low and diffusion up. The idea is that we're just getting this to become a very basic system that doesn't shift or move around too much at all. So we just get this very simple kind of turbulent smoke What I'll do now is under illumination, I'm going to add in my spotlight I've already created in your scene, and we'll just get this to cast and receive shadows. This way we can see our smoke and get an idea for what it's doing. Very simple smoke sitting in the scene. Might give it a bit more detail to work with. And I might make the color just a little bit brighter and simulate again. This way we have a bit more detail, so that way the curls are a bit finer and we also just get to see a bit more about what we're doing. I'll pause this recording while we do the simulation. The idea now is that as this moves around, there isn't really that much movement at all. Okay, so some very basic movement, not much shifting around. And we'll just soften your edges, a few things like that, just to get a bit more response. I might also bring the step size down and the jitter as well, just to kind of soften this out just a little bit. Now the main thing is that right now when these objects push through the surface, there is no real interaction at all. So what we're going to do is we're going to add in some of these objects into our system. I just took out my emitter, so I'll put that back in. We'll put in the ground, and we'll also put in just one of these objects, object 1, which is this one here. Let's run the simulation again. So now what happens is this object pushes through, and as it does that, we notice that it pushes all this smoke right through the surface as well. And then we get to see it kind of fall back down because there isn't much temperature. So as it kind of pushes up, it begins to drop back down and dissipate. I'll just run the simulation there, but as we can see, the object pushes through and then begins to drop back down. This is quite a cool motion. However, let's just say we want the smoke to become a lot more stubborn. Then what we do is we get the speed multiplier. We can set this down to 0.1. We run the simulation again, and it doesn't push through as much. The main thing is that because there's a ceiling here, it's actually pushing it right up. So let's just raise the ceiling just a tiny bit. What I'll also do here is I'm going to add in all of these objects and give our detail a bit more. Let's run the simulation. I'll pause it one more time. So here's a simulation of the first 65 frames. What I might do is just right click on my play button and turn off real time so it plays back at a bit more of an effective rate. But as we can see, all these objects push through and then throw the fluids up in the air quite nicely. What we can do here is we can set these individually to have a speed multiplier of 0.01 and see what the results are. Again, simulating 65 frames. Now we'll see that there isn't much disturbance at all. As these objects push through the surface, they don't really do much. This is because the lower the speed multiplier, the more stubborn they are, whereas the higher the speed multiplier, the more they're likely to be carried up. So lastly, if I set this to 3, and then we'll set the last two objects here, which are the ones at the back. I'll set these to 2 and 2. We'll do one last simulation. These ones have a higher speed multiplier, so they're going to shoot a lot higher up into the air. They're essentially going to be dragged and carried through the air a lot more, creating much more of an explosive effect. This is important because sometimes you will want your objects to kind of plume up into the air, giving it much more of an impact. So again, 60 frames, and this time we get much more of an explosive effect as these objects push through. Obviously you can tell which ones are the 3 and which ones are the 2, because the ones with the value of 3 pushing much higher up in the air. So again, this is a very useful way for us to create these explosive ways to push through fluids to get these cool effects. Lastly, is our final result, we're going to set all these values around 0.4 and 0.45. This will give us a nice kind of subtle motion that we're after. This is our final simulation, where our objects are able to push through casually and then begin to sink back down. Obviously the turbulence makes the smoke kind of stir up a little bit, and if we wanted to avoid that, we would give it an initial turbulent value, run the simulation, save the preset or initial state, and go from there. But this is pretty much how it's turned out, which looks quite nice. What I would do from this point with this simulation is probably add in a lot more detail. We can actually get quite detailed here because it's very, very thin. There's not as many voxels to share out. So we can actually do that and also add in fluid mapping to get more of a pattern, and that way we can get some cool results. But all in all, it looks quite nice for what we're trying to achieve here. And also if you wanted to play with the smoke colors and things like that. But that worked out quite well and gave us the result that we're after, and hopefully should give you a better understanding about how to get objects to interact with your fluids and get the actual result that you're targeting.